ようやく見つけたぜ。
Existing in the world means we must endure suffering. It's a force that we all inevitably face, and one that is impossible to escape, no matter how hard we try. Some suffering happens to us, while some suffering we have to watch happen to those we love. Whether firsthand or from the outside looking in, it all disrupts the soul. Unfortunately, it's a key aspect of our existence. Fortunately, it's not the only one. Trigun simultaneously presents the most tragic points about human existence, while also contrasting them with very positive ones. And not only does it delve into both of those extremes, but the exploration of them both in a single series is a point in and of itself. The opposing philosophical ideas create a philosophical idea. However, the exploration of duality in this show is quite multifaceted. It manages to tackle the idea from multiple angles, the spider and the butterfly scenario being a key example of this, but far from the only one. It's wild how many ways in which the struggle of duality is captured here, but it all goes to show how deeply layered the narrative is, and it manages to weave all of its ideas together pretty solidly. How you may personally feel about those ideas is another matter. You can have many different reactions to the perceptions of life, death, suffering, killing, and so on that the show conveys. It also acknowledges the pitfalls of its characters' philosophies. Nobody is presented with this perfect perception of life, though by the end it's pretty clear where the show stands on the topics it brings up. With that being said, let's dive into what you all came here for. I meant to make this video fucking forever ago, but you know what? No excuses, because I'm fucking lazy, but you know what? Here now, so, enjoy! The best place to start when discussing the philosophy of Trigun is its tonal contrast, partly because it's one of the most significant and apparent aspects of the show, but also because it accomplishes a lot within the series. It determines the narrative structure, allows the deeper philosophies to shine through, and defines both the essence of the characters and of the show itself. In many ways, Trigun is its tonal contrast. All of the substance within the series ties back to it in one way or another. When it comes to the narrative structure of the show, the story blends humor and drama throughout its first 10 episodes before embracing a darker tone in the 11th and 12th, and then continuing the downward spiral from there. The first 10 episodes themselves mimic this structure, albeit to a less intense degree. An episode can start out being funny and lighthearted, but then around the final third or so, reveal its dramatic elements, shifting the tone in a more somber direction, but doing so in a very effective and natural way. However, not every episode is trying to tug on your emotions. A good handful of them, such as episodes 1, 2, 9, and 10, focus solely on comedy, and it works really well. The characters get themselves into hectic situations, but they aren't written to be taken nearly as seriously as the situation in episode 5, for instance, when the town of Inepril is in desperate need for their plant to be fixed. In fact, it's interesting that the first 2 episodes of the show both emphasize comedy. The first impression of the narrative that you're given is a comedic one, which sets the audience's expectations in one particular direction, only to shift it when episode 3 comes around. This is our first taste of anything actually serious, showing us the tragedy of Marlin the Gunsmith, and this seriousness persists for the next handful of episodes, all the way up to 9 and 10. By giving the audience a strong, comedic impression in the beginning, it provides a striking contrast to the bleakness of the narrative later on, which is perfect for deceiving the audience's perception of the kind of show that Trigun is. On the flip side, the drama that appears now evokes a deeper feeling in the viewer. It isn't too heavy, because that would clash too much and too early on with the comedy, but it's heavy enough to where we feel the weight of what these characters have experienced, and it helps us to develop an emotional connection to them and the show as a whole. We are simultaneously deceived into not seeing Trigun as being an emotionally thick story, while also being primed for the influx of heavy emotions that are soon to come. Not only that, but by making use of particular lines of dialogue, we get important setup for character threads and themes that will make a more prominent appearance later on. The name of the game here is easing the gap between two very distinct parts. But why? What's the point in going this far with how they present the tone? Well, answering that requires two more examinations, the first of which involves us looking closely at the episode where the tone transitions. Motherfucker. Episode 12, Diablo, seems like the part of the story where the tone finally transitions. But that's not really the case. That credit goes to episode 11, Escape from Pain. Diablo certainly thrusts us into the darkness, but Escape from Pain sets the building blocks that allow for that thrust to happen in the first place. Without it, we wouldn't have a proper transition into the new tone that the second part of the story is trying to set up. So how does it execute this transition? Well, first and foremost, it executes the transition by showing the audience new things in the narrative that we haven't seen previously. That sounds simple on paper, but the nuance of it comes from the kinds of new things that we're seeing, specifically the new traits that we're seeing in the characters. The main people that act differently in this episode are Wolfwood and Vash. We'll save the cognitively impaired one for last. For now, I want to focus on Wolfwood. Wolfwood's presence in the show up to this point has largely been comedic, and his introduction in Escape from Pain is no different. We've also seen how virtuous he can be, which once again makes an appearance in this episode when he helps out more. His methods can definitely run on the rougher side of things, but they're ultimately used for good, and he hasn't gone too crazy so far, so everything's fine. However, Escape from Pain shows a far colder side to these methods than what we've seen previously. As the episode's plot develops, we learn about the human trafficking that the caravan is engaged in, and how more was almost captured and used by them. From this reveal, we're led into our first big philosophical quandary of the show, and it's one that shows how harsh Wolfwood's philosophy can be. Wolfwood carries the fewer sacrificed, the better mentality, and what makes this so significant is the circumstances that we see him apply it to. Ever since Julius learned about what the caravan was doing, he decides to leave with more and never come back. However, he's the caravan's pass into Fondrique, the city that they trade with. Therefore, by him leaving, the caravan loses their contract with the city and will inevitably go under, dooming everybody in the caravan to death. His departure may save more and prevent any profiteering off such a fucked up trade, but he in turn screws over everyone else. His action, while admirable, is ignorant of the wider scope of its consequences, which Wolfwood points out and argues that, although the sex trafficking will continue if Julius stays, more people will die if he leaves. Now, it can be pretty difficult to swallow what Wolfwood is saying because of what the caravan is doing. However, his point isn't entirely without merit. Yes, if Julius stays, then the trafficking will continue, but not everybody in the caravan is involved in that aspect of it. Therefore, by leaving, Julius condemns innocent people to lose their lives, and the amount of people that would die compared to the two that would be saved is what drives Wolfwood's stance. So what should be done? Stay and allow the evilness to continue, but save more people? Or leave and doom everybody, regardless of their innocence or guilt? At the end of the day, there's no easy answer. It's a complex moral dynamic, and not only that, but it's the first complicated moral question that the show has faced us with so far, which is significant considering that there wasn't really anything up to this point that would indicate that we would face such a dilemma. There's been sad things that we've seen previously, but nothing in the story so far has challenged our morality and views in the same way that this quandary from Escape from Pain has. Of course, we'll see more of these dilemmas as the show goes on, and those dilemmas will arguably get even darker. At the very least, they will be more prevalent in the story as it goes along. Therefore, it makes sense to dedicate this episode to introducing them. One thing I particularly love is that the rougher side of him that we saw earlier was actually a hint towards who he truly is. He isn't just a guy that plays things more dangerously than Vash. He actually has a colder outlook on morality than him, while simultaneously having a strict moral code that he's willing to go to dark lengths to uphold. We'll still see the sillier sides of him from here on out, but it won't be the only thing that defines him anymore. Not by a long shot. When we first see Vash, he isn't acting like his usual self at all. He looks completely serious and doesn't act dumb in the slightest. Usually it's the other way around. He acts goofy at first and then gets serious when the situation requires it. But here he's serious right off the bat, which is strange. He also doesn't say much, despite having never been portrayed as the strong, silent type. In fact, he's only ever been portrayed as the opposite, and him asking for money to complete the caravan leader's job, a job which, in his words, requires a kill, is the cherry on top of all of this offbeat behavior, contradicting everything we've learned about him up until now. None of this lines up with the man we thought him to be, and we're not given any reasons as to why he's acting so differently. In the end, all of this turns out to be a ruse, but why did he act so differently in the first place? What was the point in deceiving our perception of him? Vash is a complicated character. He's a man that's burdened by a heavy past and is forced to constantly suffer. He's experienced so much tragedy and sadness, and it's completely shattered his soul. He puts on a happy front, but it's exactly that, a happy front. The person we've seen is who he wants to be, and I'd argue it's who he truly is at his core, but the darker, more tragic side of his personality is every bit a part of him as well. And as the show progresses, we'll see him fight a constant war between the two. Looking at it from that angle, it becomes clear that this episode acts as a glimpse into who lies underneath the goofball we've been following this whole time, which mirrors Meryl and Millie's experience with him as well. By showing us his darker side in this episode, it prepares us for the journey that we are soon to take into the more miserable aspects of his character, and the show overall. That's why the ruse in this episode works so well. At first glance, it can seem like a pointless inclusion to give the episode tension, but that ruse is actually perfect for hinting at Vash's deeper and more tragic layers. Even Meryl reflects on how different he seemed in this episode in Diablo, which further solidifies what the creators were going for. In summary, escape from pain is opening the door that Diablo will push us through. By giving us an episode that is dedicated to introducing the darker aspects of the narrative in a relatively less intense form compared to what happens later on, it allows us to have a bit more ease when transitioning into the darkness to come. Speaking of which, the second part of this series, as I've mentioned numerous times, brings forth the darkness. The drama, which was once just a single aspect of the story, is now one of its driving forces. Everything becomes a lot sadder, and though the humor's still there, there's a very noticeable priority shift. One of the biggest differences between parts 1 and 2 is that the loss feels so much heavier in this later section, probably because death is significantly more present here than it was earlier. Before the tone shift, we only saw one person die, and all of the other suffering that we saw had to do with a given character's past trauma. Marlin, Elizabeth, Kaite, all of Enepril pretty much, and this dude, whatever the fuck his name is, are all suffering because of events of their past that distort their present. They've all experienced horribly messed up things, but they're all messed up things from the past. That doesn't take away from the pain that these events created, but they weren't events that we the audience witnessed firsthand. We see the aftermath, not the initial incident. Compare that with all the people we see die in Diablo, or the sudden deaths of everyone in Out of Time, especially Brad. Even seeing some of the villains die is pretty shocking. Not because it's all that sad that they lost their life, especially compared to the innocent people. I mean, some of these people are pretty fucking dastardly. But regardless, it still adds to a body count that we didn't see in the first half. This isn't to say that hearing about it is inherently less tragic than seeing it. It's simply to point out that the effect it has on us psychologically is more pronounced when we see the tragedy unfold in real time. It makes us feel the weight far more than hearing about it long after it's already happened. But some of the most depressing stuff in this second part doesn't even involve anybody dying. Hangfire is an episode where the majority of it is actually pretty lighthearted, until we get to the confrontation between the father and the guy who killed his daughter. This scene is incredibly hard to watch, and the lack of music and minimal sound design paired with the incredible voice acting significantly adds to that feeling. Another good example would be Vash's scream at the beginning of episode 25. And I absolutely love how we don't actually see him freaking out. We only hear it and see Meryl's reaction to it as she stands outside his room. And then right when his scream rises, we cut to the title card. It's so fucking effective and beautiful, and I absolutely love it. It's a powerful moment that emphasizes the overwhelming emotions that Vash feels after taking someone's life for the first time, something that we didn't even think he was capable of doing. Interestingly, despite how different the two parts are, the mix of humor and drama is still present. It's just that the sadness is stronger, and the comedy, while still funny, is no longer taking center stage. Part 1 focuses less on philosophy and more on forging a false perception of the show, while the second part lifts the curtain entirely and shows us everything for what it really is. There's less intricacy in the narrative structure because we don't need to be tricked into believing anything. We simply get to see reality and all the philosophy that comes with it, for better or for worse. On a first viewing, the show can feel like it has two identities mashed together, and as a result, it's hard to figure out which of them is the true face of the show. They have similarities, but they still feel like two creations in one, and seem to contradict one another. It's confusing, conflicting, and hard to make sense of, which is exactly how I'd describe a certain someone. This contradictory perception that we have, both of Vash and the show, highlights the contrasting emotions of life, and how we experience vastly different feelings that, on one hand, don't make any sense going together, but that can't not go together. Light and dark are complete opposites, yet neither can exist truly independently because they can only exist in the absence of the other. You're happy because you're not sad. You're sad because you're not happy. States of being can be inherently contradictory, while also needing to be attached to each other in order to exist. For example, we can have a happy, carefree existence that turns into a completely terrible one in the blink of an eye. We may also go the rest of our lives only experiencing pain without our fortune ever reversing. Just because things can get better doesn't mean that they will. And just because we can smile again doesn't mean we can easily regain the will to do so. Some don't even have a reason to smile when they come into this world. Existence can be blacker than the night fucking sky. And some people are unfortunately born into messed up situations, which is especially cruel considering that we're brought into this world without our consent, and in turn, we can be subjected to some of the worst evils of humanity. Now, I'm not an anti-natalist by any means, but whether or not I am doesn't change the fact that some people are fucked upon arrival in this world, and that some people never escape the misery that's forced upon them. But even if you're brought up in a relatively stable way, suffering is right around the corner. After all, we can't leave this life without scars. But that doesn't mean that those scars won't heal, and it doesn't mean that all scars are large and debilitating. Paper cuts suck, but the pain fades pretty quickly. Large cuts can be horrific, but you can heal from them, even if it leaves a distinguishing mark. Some people can't repair those scars. This much is true, but that doesn't mean that you have to be one of them. This all makes the world a much harder place to figure out and navigate in, because what even is the world if you can go from happy one moment to destroyed in the next? What is the world when you can arise from that destruction and find happiness once again? What is the world when some people can't arise from destruction at all? And what is the world when we can find so much happiness in it, yet so much darkness surrounds it? None of these concepts should go together, yet they inevitably do. Our journeys through life aren't perfect mirrors of each other's, but the experience of light and dark is an inevitability for everyone, and Trigun's tonal structure and protagonist are perfect emblems of this. By having two identities in the show that embody both light and dark, it accurately represents our experience as human beings by showing the extreme contrast between those two concepts, and by showing the brutal experiences of the characters that have to wade through this internal paradox. Their experience mirrors ours, and in turn shows the struggles of coming to terms with the insane emotional and moral contrast that exists in the world, and the suffering that results because of this. The tonal dichotomy also reflects the dual nature of the most important characters, and, like the real world, forces us to confront not only their differing sides, but forces us to try and figure out which side of them is their true nature. Our stories are never completely written until we die, and we constantly have to shift between so many different things that confuse us and change our perception of reality, and Trigun does an excellent job at capturing this. The clashing tones of the show perfectly reflects the clashing tones of humanity, and I, for one, think that's fucking brilliant. But our analytical journey isn't over yet, my friends. Now that we've covered what the tone achieves and represents, let us move on to the genesis of the narrative. The start of it all, if you will. Episode 17.
From the tip.
Fucking my body. We gonna drink some midnight chain. Yo.
Episode 17 treats us to Vash's backstory, and the backstory of how humanity arrived on the desert planet that the series takes place on. It's also our first introduction to Knives, who we see for the first time in the series. The episode begins with humanity roaming through space, searching for a new planet to live on. There's only a handful of people running the ship, and tagging along with them are Vash and Knives. When we first see Knives, he's completely reserved and polite, and even looks slightly embarrassed as Vash makes a fool of himself. It's apparent that he's the more mature of the two, but he doesn't come across as someone who thinks of himself as being superior to others. He just seems like a good kid, not too dissimilarly from our protagonist, someone who we know as being kind to a fault. After the opening scene, Knives seeks out Vash and Rem to have lunch, and they talk about how they're going to recreate Earth on a new planet, where there will be peace instead of war and thievery, and it'll be great. They're going to construct an Eden where people can live as people. We then transition into the next scene, which details how humanity destroyed Earth and was forced to leave due to their overconsumption of resources. This transition is brilliant, and here's why. The characters just talked about creating a new Eden where people can live as people, but immediately afterwards, we see how people living as people destroyed the planet that those people lived on. We humans have been polluting and plundering this planet for fucking eons now, and when it comes to war, human history shows that it's a very natural part of our existence. The thievery part seems a little random, but I mean, humans are no stranger to stealing, so it works, I guess. The point is that the way humans live is destructive, and this destruction got so bad that it forced humanity from its home. So when we talk about people living as people, that might not be as ideal as it seems. After the history lesson, Joey and Rem drink coffee and talk about the kids. Considering how much he butters her up, I do wonder if my man is just trying to slide inside.
いや君は彼らにいろいろなものを与えているよ。感情とか優しさとか未来の価値とかね。
Yeah, he's definitely trying to fuck. Nonetheless, their conversation eventually leads to Joey asking why the kids appeared. And Rem, being her normal hippie self, says that they're angels that God sent to point them in the right direction. From there, we abruptly cut to the exterior of the ship, accompanied by very loud sounds of it running. And this is a nice way to add an ominous touch to her comments about Vash and Knives. It's not a flattering follow-up, and we'll eventually see why. We cut back inside to the control room, and now would be the perfect time to talk about our favorite sexual degenerate, Steve, aka the breaking point that turns Knives from a kind young boy into a fucking maniac. Steve, due to his own insecurities and genuine fear, abuses the kids. He chalks them up to being monsters because of their vast growth rate and level of intelligence at such a young age. Later on, as Vash cries over Steve's treatment, Knives finds him and tries to reason that this is something that they're just going to have to bear with, saying that, to the people on the ship, they're uninvited guests. It's an unfortunate sacrifice, but one that they're going to have to make. This thought process is inspired by what Joey taught him in the education room, and Knives applies that thinking to this situation. It's very logical and level-headed thinking, especially considering the circumstances. But later on, when lying down with Vash, Knives begins to examine their situation more closely, and questions whether or not he will be eaten one day. Not in a literal sense, I hope, but in the sense of his own well-being. Him and Vash are foreign entities to these people, and humans being humans, they naturally reject those that are different. Everyone besides Steve might be nice to them now, but when the kids first appeared, the crew all had their guns on them, with Rem being the only one to protect them. Only one person gave them a chance from the get-go. The rest treated Knives and Vash like a threat from the jump. As we all know, human beings fear the unknown, and while most of the crew has grown past their fear of the kids, things could have gone in a very different way, especially if Rem wasn't there. Vash and Knives will forever be outliers amongst these people. Even if they eventually integrate into the rest of humanity, they will always be different from them, and that fact is potentially dangerous, which Steve perfectly embodies. Even when Knives questions the idea of being eaten, Vash tells him that they're going to build a different kind of Eden, indirectly admitting that humans have already engaged in the kinds of activities that Knives is afraid of, but supposedly they're not going to repeat it. Now sure, maybe they won't repeat this behavior, but the possibility is still there and is currently being exercised by one of the crew, and was almost exercised by the majority of them. Not only that, but human behavior has a tendency to repeat, so Vash and Ren can say that those negative traits from the old days won't follow them into the new ones, but how do we really know that? If we're still seeing those negative traits, doesn't that contradict what they're saying? Doesn't that mean that the others might do the same once the rest of humanity wakes up? Humans treat different groups of human beings terribly just because they're different, despite the fact that they're still human. I can only imagine what they would be like towards intelligent beings that are a different species entirely. So while Steve may have been the breaking point for Knives, his actions were one factor amongst many. With a deeper knowledge of human beings and his experiences on the ship, Knives comes to realize the major flaws in human nature and subsequently rejects them. Steve is merely the force that pushes Knives over the edge, but Knives had to be near enough to the cliff in order to fall off in the first place. Maybe he wasn't standing right at the edge, maybe he didn't even consider walking off at all, but he had to be capable of going closer, not only because of his experiences, but because of his personality. If Knives' personality wasn't one of the things that drove him to become who he is, then why wouldn't Vash turn out exactly like him? This might seem like an obvious point, and it kind of is, but their differences go beyond what's noticeable on a surface level, and heavily tie into the themes of the series. The main and most important difference between them is their natural affiliations with emotion and logic. Knives is Vash's logical anchor, and we see this when Knives tries to comfort Vash after Steve's abuse. Vash breaks down in tears while Knives remains calm. He rationalizes the situation, not in a way to absolve Steve, but to make it clear what the reality of the situation is. Steve's abuse has an effect on Knives too, but it leads down a road of internalization. Vash, on the other hand, resorts to an outward display of emotion. And I don't mean that in a bad way. Emotions are a beautiful thing, and are something that everybody should express and embrace. However, emotions are a cloud, whereas logic is a sword. Emotions can fog our perceptions, and keep us from judging things accurately. Logic, on the other hand, is sharp and definite. It assesses the reality of a given thing and acts according to that reality. It doesn't lose itself in feelings, no matter what, which is good because we shouldn't lose sight of how things really are. The problem with this is that humans are not entirely logical creatures. To a great extent, we're guided by our emotions, and various situations can bring them out and make them even stronger. And there isn't always a fine line between emotions and logic. Anybody's quote-unquote logic can still come from a place of bias. People can rationalize their feelings to make them seem logical when they really aren't, and we can do this not just to other people, but to ourselves. We can be objective, it's just incredibly hard to do so. We can't help it. Emotions are deeply ingrained into our DNA. But logic is too, hence why Joey said that we have the capacity to judge a situation and find the best possible outcome. But trying only to view things logically misses a part of what makes us human. Emotions and identity are a beautiful thing, even if they can lead us astray. Ideally, there should be a fine balance between emotions and logic since they are both equally important, and neither can be separated from us. But what's always separated Knives and Vash is their natural affiliation with one or the other. Their affiliations aren't aggressive in the beginning, but as events unfold, the differences in their thinking is brought out of them. They begin to think too differently from one another, and this is embodied perfectly in the spider and the butterfly scene. To quickly recap everything that leads up to the spider and the butterfly scenario, Knives comes to his personal realizations about humanity and leaves to give himself his own fate. Then the three of them go to eat in the dining room with the rest of the crew, while Steve drinks his inadequacies away nearby. Steve then makes his way over to the table and, unsurprisingly, creeps on Mary. After that, Knives goes to the rooms of both Rowan and Mary to speak with them. And from there, we cut to the most important scene of this entire episode, and arguably the most important of the entire show. In the spider and the butterfly dynamic, the spider, aka the predator, eats the butterfly, aka the prey. Vash wants to save both of them, but Knives steps in before he can and kills the spider. He says that it's easier this way, assuming that Vash is only trying to save the butterfly, when in reality, he's trying to save both. Knives questions this, noting that spiders need to catch butterflies or else they'll die of starvation. Rem responds, saying that he shouldn't make the choice between life or death so easily, and Knives retorts that if you continue to save butterflies, the spider will inevitably die, pointing out that to save both is a contradiction, and that deliberating allows the butterfly to be eaten in the meantime. To Knives, saving both is not only a lose-lose scenario, but it also goes against the nature of predators and prey. Now, a bad person is not going to die just because they can't harm anybody. The point of that part of the analogy is to show how saving both predator and prey contradicts the dynamic of those two. The law of predator and prey dictates that the former hunts the latter. Whether it's done for nutrition or maliciousness, it's what they're meant to do. The dynamic leads to one losing to the other, and the one that loses is the one that's weakest. Because of that, it's understandable to want to save the prey from the predator. There's nothing wrong with that, and Knives would agree. After all, he intervenes by killing the spider, not the butterfly. However, to try and bypass nature by saving both is foolish to him, because he understands that the predator and prey dynamic only plays out one way, and that any loopholes around it create ramifications, not remedies. Again, in regards to people, predators won't die if they can't perpetuate harm, but allowing their existence to remain gives them further opportunity to rain chaos. And if it's in a predator's nature to hunt prey, then it stands to reason that they're not going to suddenly lose that nature just because you saved their life. The spider doesn't cease to be a spider just because its environment changes, and the butterfly doesn't cease to be prey if the predator is still around. In the mind of Knives, only one can live because one has to die. It's just a matter of picking whether it's the predator or prey that does. Vash can't handle this idea, and Rem is clearly disturbed by Knives' actions. But the cold reality of it all is that Knives is kind of right. His thinking is perfectly logical despite its ruthlessness. The spider can't suddenly abandon its diet for the sake of the prey. If it doesn't obey its nature, it suffers, and this applies to how Knives views human beings. He sees the worst in humanity, not just from learning about their messy history, but also from his and Vash's experiences with them on the ship. He's beginning to see them more and more as predators and is gradually foregoing any notions of them being butterflies. He's not quite at the genocidal point that he'll soon reach, but this scene lays the building blocks for that transformation to happen. Something that makes Knives' thinking interesting is that he genuinely wants to save the prey. Although he takes a very maniacal turn as the series unfolds, his philosophy always comes down to protecting innocence. He wants to be a savior, just like Vash, but their philosophy towards what they consider innocence is what differs, and ultimately tears them apart, once again highlighting the emotional and logical divide between them. There's even more nuance to the spider and the butterfly dynamic, especially with what we see after episode 17, but we'll explore that later on. For now, let's return to the show. The episode continues and we see the trial of Steve, who's arrested due to accusations of him raping Mary. As a result, he's detained in the freezer until the end of their mission. This leads to Rowan proposing to Mary, who rejects him. He then reveals that he tinkered with the freezer and killed Steve, which, understandably, freaks her out. Rem and the kids suddenly hear gunshots and head over to see what's going on, and see Rowan killing Mary. Then he points his gun at Knives, who orchestrated the framing of Steve and manipulated Mary and Rowan into carrying it out. And this is the moment where we get to see the spider and the butterfly dynamic in action. Rem stands in the way of Rowan's gun and protects the two boys, and proceeds to try and reason with Rowan about lowering his gun. and this is where things get interesting. In this situation, Rowan is obviously the spider, and Rem is both the butterfly and the savior. On one hand, she's in harm's way, which would make her the prey, but on the other hand, she's trying to save Rowan, the predator. By putting her life on the line to make sure that there aren't any casualties, she fulfills the same role that Vash was trying to do out in the field. But with how unhinged Rowan is, it makes the situation scary because she could lose her life at any minute. One wrong word or false move, and this dude could be set off. Her deliberations could ultimately be her undoing. It would be so much simpler if she just had him taken out. Perhaps, but things aren't that simple. Moments ago, Rowan said that something is broken inside of him and that he can't stop. A part of him seems to want to, but he's so absorbed in his torn frame of mind. It then becomes clear that whatever manipulation Knives employed on Rowan turned him into the psycho we're currently seeing. Of course, just like Knives, the seeds had to already be in place in order for him to become what we currently see. Regardless, it's clear that whatever Knives did to him left a pretty detrimental impact on his mental state. Rowan, of course, is still responsible for his actions, but this obviously isn't some horrible human being that gets off on murdering people. But at this moment, he's posing a very, very serious threat. So what should they do? Joey decides for them and ejects Rowan out of the ship. How Rem wasn't sucked out with him and Mary, I do not know, but what's done is done, and Rem breaks down as a result. She laments that Rowan wasn't going to shoot her, and Joey says that, from his perspective, he couldn't see that, and made his decision based on the options open to him. Knives comes in and agrees with Joey, saying that he thinks he did the right thing by ejecting Rowan. But all that is ruined the moment Joey laments that maybe Rem was right, and that if she was, he would be in the wrong. Knives doesn't like this, obviously, and decides that Joey should die since he's just a human like the rest of them, and, obviously, he shoots him. Fucking psycho. He then makes it so that the ships carrying the humans will crash while blaming it on Rowan, and then he gets Rem and Vash to go with him to the pods. At the last minute, Rem decides that she wants to try and save the ships, and so she sacrifices herself to do so. Vash loses himself inside of the pod, while Knives cackles about it and reveals his actions. But, much to Knives' dismay, Rem actually succeeds and thwarts Knives' plan. From that, we now have the origin behind the desert planet, Vash, and Knives. It was a hell of a journey, and I think this episode is actually one of the best of the whole show, and carries a significant amount of depth. But the depth within trails outward, and not only gives the show more philosophical ideas to explore, but the spider and the butterfly dynamic that was explored here gains even more significance as the show continues. So, let's wrap this all up, shall we? Now that we've examined the larger, overarching themes of the show, it's time to analyze the themes that trickle down from them. The tonal dichotomy and the spider and the butterfly scenario are deep topics on their own, but they create the groundwork for even more ideas to shine through. And those subsequent ideas expand upon the overarching themes in a way that gives them more nuance than they already have. Episodes 3, 18, and 24 are all excellent depictions of the spider and the butterfly dynamic. Episode 3 is about Marlin the gunsmith, and his opposition to doing anything to help people in need. His philosophy is that helping people is discriminatory. You help out one person and someone else gets fucked over in turn. By not helping those in need, he helps out those that aren't, because they won't eventually suffer the consequences of his aid. This all sounds illogical until you look at why he believes these things. A long time ago, Marlin's town was attacked by bandits, and Marlin went door to door passing out guns so that everybody could protect themselves. At some point afterwards, one of the people he gave a gun to robbed a bank and killed all the people inside, among which were Marlin's wife and child. Knowing that, it makes sense why Marlin approaches conflict the way that he does. He helped people, and that help was used against him. It led not only to others losing their lives, but to Marlin's own personal tragedy. His philosophy, which used to sound silly, is now kind of justified, and it's this philosophy that ties into the spider and the butterfly dynamic. Towards the end of the episode, thugs come to the town to rob an armored car. Vash plans to help, but Marlin shoots down every idea that he comes up with and advocates for doing nothing. Vash makes the point that this situation isn't equal, and makes up a fake scenario to prove his point. Even if people aren't being physically hurt, they're still having their livelihood taken from them, which is still a huge blow to them. This situation is bad, and doing nothing isn't helping out, it's just doing nothing. Meanwhile, people suffer at the hands of a predator that has no plans to stop unless someone steps up. An important part of the spider and the butterfly scenario is about choosing between action and inaction when confronted with a predator and prey conflict. Whether your form of action is pacifistic or not, action still needs to be taken in order to help those that need helping. Marlin's scared that any action of his could lead to more suffering, but whether he steps in or not, somebody can always be hurt. And just because he does step in, doesn't mean that someone else later on will suffer because of it. At the end of the day, anyone currently suffering is currently suffering, and they'll continue to suffer until the situation turns around or is flat out abandoned, but only one of those leads to a positive outcome. Luckily, Vash gets through to Marlin and he comes around in the end. Interestingly, episode 18 is where we see Vash take the opposite stance. After destroying Augusta, Vash retreats to the city of Casted and decides to live a quiet life. He's dissuaded from intervening in conflicts anymore because of how much death and destruction follows him whenever he does. For the most part, all of this is outside of Vash's control. He's not inviting the chaos to follow him, and though he could have taken the bad guys out by killing them, it's not Vash's fault that they decided to commit murder and bring harm to those around them. Sure, death and destruction are quite attached to Vash, but he's not responsible for the horrific actions that Legato and his crew commit. But he still feels the weight of it all, and, like Marlin, assumes it's his fault and retreats from doing anything, thinking that inaction is best. It takes a while in the show for Vash to get to this point, and it's understandable why he feels the way that he does. But, similarly to Marlin, inaction doesn't help anything. When Lena is captured by a pedo, and Vash overhears this, it dawns on him that retreating isn't anything other than retreating. Wolfwood helps Vash to see this, just like Vash did for Marlin, and despite his fondness for his new life, Vash decides to step up and act. Episode 24, however, presents the idea of acting from a very different perspective. This is the episode where Vash finally takes a life, and it's because he has no other options. There is no perfect solution here to save everybody. In fact, the only way to save anybody is to kill one particular person. If Vash doesn't kill Legato, then the villagers under his control will kill Meryl and Millie. His only option to save innocent people, his only viable form of acting, is to murder, and after much hesitation, he does just that. The most important thing that these 3 episodes communicate is the importance of taking action. Regardless of what your methods are for doing so, it's obvious that a lack of action leads to more suffering. Staying complicit in the face of hardship does nothing but allow more hardship to breed. However, taking action won't always look the same depending on the situation, and regardless of your beliefs, you might have to do something that you don't want to do in order for the best possible outcome, which episode 24 embodies. It isn't trying to contradict Vash's beliefs. There's absolutely merit to trying to save everybody and not rushing to killing as a solution. But to go around thinking that saving everybody is always an option is naive, and it's not worth allowing an antagonistic force to survive if they can't be reasoned with, and will only cause more harm if left alive. Vash isn't wrong for wanting to save everybody, but things don't always work out so cleanly. And even when he has saved everybody, it comes at a great cost to his own well-being. It's worth it to him in the end, but it emotionally and physically destroys him. Besides, even if you try to save everybody, it doesn't mean that you'll always be successful. There's only so much you can do because there's only so much you can control. Our powers are limited and our options are brutally small. And at the end of the day, you have to make a choice. Whether good or bad, pacifistic or not, you have to choose. And it most likely won't be a perfect choice. But all you can do is to try and make the right one. But how do we know whether or not that choice is the right one? Sparing people isn't always the correct option, and neither is killing. Everyone's ticket to the future is blank, meaning that you can do whatever you want with your life, and if you fuck up, you can always turn things around if you try. You aren't condemned to repeat your actions. Or are you? To answer that, let's examine 3 characters from the show that best represent the ideas about pacifism and redemption, those being Monev, Slater Polo, and Zazie the Beast. The first time we see Monev, he's training in a cell that he's been locked in for 20 years in order to become strong enough to fight Vash. Later, after the two confront each other, Monev murders a ton of innocent people because Vash keeps running away and trying to save everyone. It's horrific as fuck to see, and it's the first time in the show that we see such a massive amount of people die. But what's interesting about this scene is what Monev says afterwards.
俺はこれで自由だ。これで好きに生きることができるんだ。
This, paired with what he says to Vash in the jail cell, paints him in a pretty interesting light. All of this raises the possibility that his motivation for being a monster is more complicated than we might think. His disregard for life may possibly be as a result of having been trapped in hell his whole life. It's arguable that he's not a guy that was driven to do what he did because he enjoys killing people, but that he was driven to such a psychotic point because of horrible circumstances. When he decides to shoot up the entire town, he does so because Vash keeps outmaneuvering his gunfire. Vash does this in order to get people out of the way and save them, which frustrates Monev and leads him to doing what he does. Monev kills the townspeople, and Vash almost kills him because of this. He ends up sparing him, but was this the correct answer? On one hand, Monev has come from harsh circumstances, and his only way out of them is to kill Vash, thus explaining his desperation. If Vash keeps running away from him, Monev can't escape his hell. But on the flip side, he still killed a ton of innocent people for his own selfish gain. Whether he has his reasons or not, that fact can't be ignored. It's important to note that trauma can lead someone to developing deeply negative approaches and attitudes towards life. It can disconnect you from your own humanity and distort you into the worst version of yourself. But even if he turned out to be a saint at his core, he still robbed people of their lives, so when his life is finally threatened, does he really have the right to ask for it? Furthermore, what if he's not a good person at all? Bad environment or not, what if he's just a piece of shit? Not everyone who's lived a bad life is an angel deep down. All of this makes Monev's character harder to come to terms with, and it makes it harder to answer the question of whether or not he deserves to be redeemed. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Slater Polo and his confrontation with Benson Free and Hangfire that I mentioned earlier. Benson holds Slater at gunpoint because Slater murdered Benson's daughter, and apparently in a pretty fucked up way. Unlike Monev, we're never given any backstory for Slater that suggests that he might have a troubled soul. On top of that, he murdered an innocent girl. She might have been a Free, and the Free are in conflict with the Polos, but the daughter had nothing to do with the conflict. She was completely innocent, but Slater decided to kill her anyway, for seemingly no reason. He did it just to do it, and then he has the balls to start begging for his own life. Benson then makes the point that his daughter must have begged as well, and when Slater begins crying out for his father, Benson says that his daughter must have done the same thing. This whole scene is brutal, but this moment in particular is hard-hitting. Eventually, Benson tearfully realizes that he can't kill him and spares him. But did Slater deserve to be spared? Vash jumps in and pleads for Benson not to kill him, but he's only begging because he can't stand to see death, not because Benson would be inherently wrong for taking Slater's life. After all, it wouldn't be very hard to argue that Slater deserved to be killed. He did a horrendous thing to an innocent person, so why should he keep his life? Is it really taking the high road if you spare a monster? Especially when you're not given a single reason for why that person might be that monster? It wouldn't justify his actions even remotely, but like with Monev, it would at least make us question what drives him to be the way that he is. These are decent questions, but we have one more character to examine before we answer them. Zazie the Beast is interesting because although he's a perfect example of the pacifist/redemption theme, he comes at it from a very different angle than the other two. We don't watch Zazie commit an atrocity and then wonder afterwards if he deserves his life. Instead, we see Zazie on the cusp of taking someone's life, that someone being Vash. The kid, who we thought was just a kid, turns out to be a gung-ho gun, and he's pointing his weapon at innocent people. He's prepared to take someone's life. Or is he? Zazie seems like a threat, but perhaps he isn't. Maybe he truly is just forcing himself. he was crying out just the night before and calling out for his parents. So he might just be trying to put on a tough front, but maybe there's someone underneath the person he's projecting. Maybe he's not the threat that he makes himself out to be. But he still poses the threat, and Wolfwood decides to take care of that. We'll never know if Zazie could have been converted towards being a better person. He didn't seem as far gone as Monev, and he was nowhere near as sick as Slater, so maybe, if the right words reached him, he could have chosen a different path. Vash saw something more in him. Perhaps this was Vash being too trusting, but what if it wasn't? What if something more than murder could have been done for Zazie? We'll never know, because Wolfwood removed the possibility of redemption. So was Wolfwood wrong? Yes and no. He has a bad habit of jumping to killing as the solution, but sometimes, as Vash is forced to learn, death is the only solution. If Wolfwood didn't see any alternatives, then killing the kid was the only solution to save the most amount of people. Is he at fault for doing what he thought was the most moral route to take? At the end of the day, I think the answer to all of these questions is that there really isn't an answer, at least not a universal one, because all of these instances operate on a case-by-case basis. In a sense, each situation has its own answer. Everyone, whether good or bad, is different, and one bad person may be more deserving of redemption than another. A bad person might be good at their core, but does such heinous things that it's hard to argue for their redemption. And sometimes a bad person is better off dead because of the fucked up things they could do if left alive. So at that point, whether or not they deserve redemption or death becomes a personalized and context-dependent decision. The problem is that if you fall down only ever committing to one option or the other, whether it's pacifism or killing, you remove all nuance from how you approach a particular situation. In my opinion, both pacifism and killing have worthwhile functions, and only using one removes all nuance from how to approach a given situation. But things aren't that simple. Wolfwood finally decides to choose pacifism in episode 23, and he dies because of it. In the context of this moment, Wolfwood's master didn't want to kill him, Legato took control of him. But it still presents the idea that even when taking what you think is the right option, you can still be punished for it, and it makes sense that Wolfwood questions whether or not he made the correct decision since he's now dying because of it. In Zazie's episode, a group of townspeople want to kill Vash and Wolfwood for something they didn't even do, and the only reason the townspeople don't go through with it is because they get interrupted, not because Vash gets through to them. You can try to be pacifistic, but it doesn't always work. But on the other hand, killing can be too final. And if it turns out that you could have gotten through to that person, then what did you kill them for? And as humans, we can grow from our mistakes and embrace a better future, even if our mistakes are vast. Ultimately, we never really know what the right decision is. All we can really do is have a set of principles to work by that are open-minded enough to consider different solutions. We're not always going to execute our decisions perfectly, and that's one of the many unfortunate aspects of life. But we can make do with what we have, and so long as we try, we can do something good. People are complicated, and dealing with them is even more so. But by not losing your way and succumbing to only one extreme thought or another, you'll at least be in a better place than staying only in one lane. No one gains anything from only thinking or acting in extremes, which humans are unfortunately so prone to do. That extreme thinking leads to an important question. Is humanity worth saving? It's easy to argue either way. Humanity does enough fucked up things so often, and as a species we always seem to repeat our mistakes. So what's the point of preserving us? Why save something that's not only destructive, but has always been destructive, and doesn't seem to want to change that destructive behavior? This is pretty much Knives' outlook on humanity. To him, they're the spiders that eat butterflies. And you know what? He's not entirely wrong. Humans can absolutely be spiders, both on an individual and a species level. We tear down the world around us so much, as well as each other. We have a bad habit of being assholes, and that habit of ours can ruin existence. So if all that's the case, why should we give any credence to Vash's perspective on humanity? He obviously wants to preserve humans and hates seeing even the worst of us die. But he's naive, right? No, not entirely, and here's why. Existence is not a complete shit show. I know it seems like it, and there's many unstable factors in the world that seem as if they could tear everything down, and they very well could, but that negativity doesn't define the entirety of life. There's so much to appreciate about the world around us and the people in it. There's also the little things that bring us joy, such as hobbies and activities, socializing with people we like, pursuing passions, and so on. Life isn't perfect or easy by any means, but there's so much to get out of living once you let go of the incessant negativity. That's easier said than done, and I get that not everybody is at a point in their life where things are looking up for them, but they can get to that point. I speak from experience. I've gone through a lot of things throughout my life that drove me to some seriously dark depths, so I know what it's like to live in that abyss and feel as if there's no way out. But there absolutely is. Life can 100% get better. And no, it will never be perfect, and there's always going to be setbacks, but that doesn't diminish the fact that life can improve, especially if you try to make it better. You won't always succeed, and outside factors can certainly prevent you from doing so, but why give up before the clocks run out? Why live waiting for something horrible to happen when it might not? Just because the worst case scenario does exist, doesn't mean that we'll reach it. We might, but we also might not. My point is that yes, there are a lot of downsides to life, and human beings as a whole, but the positives are worth fighting for, and the possibility of a better future is worth living for as well. Why secede to our darkest traits when humans barely even try to embrace their positive ones? We have the same capacity for light that we do dark. Even if we engage more with the bad than the good, if we truly tap into that positive potential, who the hell knows what we might unlock? The problem with Knives is that he can only see what we do wrong. He only sees humanity as being spiders, despite our capacity for being butterflies. The problem with Vash is that he focuses too hard on our humanity. He acknowledges that we can be butterflies, but he doesn't always accept how bad our spider traits can be. They both think in extremes instead of taking both ideas into account. It's important to acknowledge the bad because we need to understand our faults so that we can improve, and to also not be blindsided by how shitty we can be. And it's equally important to understand what we get right so that we have hope for our future and build towards a better one. I'm not saying that humans are perfect, and we're certainly not easy to help. We are the roadblock that impedes progress, and we are the only ones that can remove that very barrier, and we need to. We have too much to lose because we have so much to give and gain. We can't allow our pettiness and unwillingness to change to halt progress. We just can't. And maybe we'll never be able to step over our self-imposed walls, but it's at least worth a shot. And I think that when we do actually listen, when we put down the ego, we can reason with each other. But it's true that a lot of people don't want to reason or listen. A lot of people, like Knives, don't even try. A lot of people, like Knives, think they're doing the right thing, even though they're really not. And, like Knives, they make existence harder for everybody. But we shouldn't give up. We need to try. Otherwise, we'll have to say the most tragic of farewells. Life is a complicated mess. It's hard to wade through its many emotions and to bridge the gap between them. Sometimes it gets so hard that we might not want to wade through them at all. Sometimes it's easier to let the various clashes of the world eat us alive, or to react strongly to them in a way that might lead us astray. It's easy to do those things, and I understand why someone would. I often do them myself. But, hard as it may be, we have to confront those complicated questions, and we have to try to come at them from as measured a place as we can. If we don't, we'll continue to tear each other apart as a species, and if we ignore these questions or quandaries outright, then nothing will ever get fixed. Life is a hard balance to walk, because there's so many things we should do, but differing perspectives make it harder to figure out how to do those things the right way. And some people are unwilling to budge on how they think something should be done. This is a major obstacle, but look at Vash. Many times in the show, Vash is labeled as the other option. He's the answer that breaks the mold of how everyone thinks things should be done. And we can apply this same thinking. We can break out of the box we put ourselves in and find that third solution. We just have to try. Instead of giving in to the answers we always give, why not find another? Maybe there is someone who's too unwilling to budge, but maybe there's another angle that would convince that person. Maybe we can acquire enough support outside of that person that weakens that unreasonable person or force. Maybe there's another solution entirely that we hadn't even conceived of, but we won't know unless we try. The conflicting natures of the world, whether it's the conflicting tones, the conflicting personalities, perspectives, and so on, make this world infinitely harder to navigate in. I often find myself dissuaded by it to a pretty significant degree, but that feeling of connecting with another person, that feeling of truly and honestly reaching into them and them reaching into you, and the beautiful feeling that results because of that, is what we should fight for. It's what we should use to fight back against the dissuading feeling the world forces onto us. It's what we should use to remind ourselves that we're all human, and that we're better together, not apart. The chaotic philosophy we see in this series reflects the chaotic philosophy of our world. And if we don't try to understand and rein in that chaos, we will become nothing but it. For as much as the show portrays the negatives that come with life, it also shows us the positives. And if it didn't believe in that positivity, if it didn't believe in fighting for it, if it didn't believe in its existence within human beings, it wouldn't display it. Once again, life's not easy at all. The moment this video ends is the moment the world could as well. And maybe that's the ultimate fate of humanity. It's possible, but so is the inverse. The decision of whether or not we reach that improved iteration of ourselves rests entirely on us. The process of doing these things is much harder than just saying them. And I do have plenty of pessimistic thoughts and feelings towards the world. There's a lot of times where I do lose hope and get so angry at humanity. But in the end, I think it's worth it to try and make a better world. It's worth putting in the work, because if we surpass that self-imposed wall, beauty may very well be on the other side.
Okay, it's childish, Gambino, homegirl, drop it like the NASDAQ. Move white girls like this coke up my ass crack. Move black girls, cause man, fuck it, I'll do either. I love pussy, I love bitches, dude, I should be running Peter in Adidas with some short shorts. B-O-O all over me, my green is where it's supposed to be. Your green is in my grocery, this Asian dude, I stole his girl, and now he got that Kochi beef. My dick is like an accent mark, it's all about the over ease. Hot like a parked car, I sound weird like nigga with a hard R. Fly like the logo on my cousin's 440. Eating Oreos like these white girls that blow me. Vodka for my ladies, whiskey for a grown man. Hanging in the islands looking for Earl like Toe Jam. I made the beat retarded, so I'm calling it a slow jam. Butcher and I know it, man. Kill beef, go ham.